In this lesson, we're concerned about culture theory and inequality. Culture theory has a history that dates back to the 1800s when Tyler first used the word culture to mean something different from what it meant at the time, which was that at the time, culture just meant, that you were well versed in the lore of your culture, so you were cultured. But Tyler expanded the definition to mean basically all of the lore and practices of all of the societies of the world. And in the subsequent 150 years, anthropologists, sociologists, and many other sorts of people have attempted to develop a workable theory of culture. Probably the person early on who did the most work was Clark Whistler of the American Museum in New York, who is credited with having developed so many definitions of culture that later scholars had to divide them into categories and think about them as being entirely separate things. But most of those early definitions of culture had to do with the study of small societies by anthropologists. But in the 20th century, sociologists brought the use of culture to mass societies, beginning with Emil Durkheim in the late 1800s, and in the 1930s or so, people who were studying culture in mass societies took on the points of view of a historian named Karl Marx and began to use critical theory to try to dissect exactly what the various aspects of culture are. In your readings for this week, what you'll see by Gartman that two of the prominent practitioners of this critical point of view are Adorno, who is a German scholar, actually a musician at the roots of his life, but also a famous intellectual and person who had to leave Germany after as the Nazis were taking over in the 1930s, spent some time in America, eventually returned to Europe and continued his work there. His career kind of centers around the second quarter of the 20th century. And then another great figure in critical theory of culture is Pierre Bourdieu, who was French. He's somewhat later than Adorno, but their careers overlapped. Most of Bourdieu's work was done in the second half of the 20th century, and the part that we're concerned about with is the third quarter of the 20th century, where he was working out his ideas about what he calls the habitus. And actually, Bourdieu's idea of the habitus is kind of a theory of the transmission of culture, how individuals absorb certain aspects of behavior from people around them, from their culture at large, and so on, and develop a kind of an internal processor, cultural processor, I guess you would call it, and that's how they know from moment to moment through their lives how, what the cultural norms are and how to affect those things. Also, something that's interesting about, and important for that matter, about the critical theory people and Marxists is that they're very activist. They view their work as in some fashion or another bettering the cultures that they work in, and as we'll see later on, in the bettering the world. The 2 points of view that are evaluated in Gartman's article have to do with Adorno's point of view that um, culture in uh, in mass societies is basically trying to hide some of the inequities of society under a culture of democracy, and in doing so, they bring about a situation where uh, conditions can worsen, and eventually you get revolutions and things like that. But in the case of Bourdieu, he sees culture as symbolizing through categories and through this idea of the habitus, ways to bring order out of the chaos that potentially exists in very large, complex societies. We've run into this idea before. If you'll recall, when we were reading about gender, we talked about how gender has potentially unpleasant aspects to it, but it's also necessary for society to genderify at least in some limited number of categories the people to bring some order to how the society functions. You should read over the study guide in particular before this one, so you have some kind of guidance on what you're getting into here, because this is as the critical theorists' points of view on things tend to be rather complex and logical, and they're concerned with dilemmas and contradictions, and so you kind of have to sit down and follow the lines of your article with your finger and think about these things. We're just assigning you part of the article. You'll see in the study guide that we just want to take those points of view of Bourdieu and Adorno and let them be the point of departure for your own thinking about what culture is and the dilemmas and concepts that brings up. So be prepared to spend some time with this article. It's not something that you can just breeze through.